The new Financial Restructuring and Bankruptcy Law in the UAE took effect May 1st of 2024. It marks a significant milestone in the country's legal framework when addressing financial distress, financial restructuring, and financial risk management. There are numerous positive economical impacts, such as it can save companies, save jobs, and save significant lives. There are new opportunities for investors, borrowers, financial institutions, banks, and foreign direct investments. It's one of many major steps in developing and maturing the financial market in the Middle East. Let me dive in, and I'm going to start with Jody, our lawyer. If you could kindly define for us in business terms, what is the law about? What does this mean?
Sure. Morning, everyone. I think probably just to take a step back, I think bankruptcy, insolvency probably was talked about the most in 2008, 2009 with the financial crisis. And I think there was a lot of misconception about the UAE. We did have a bankruptcy law at the time. It was just in the commercial transactions law. But no one thought it was actually a viable framework to use. And you saw Dubai World with its own decree and a lot of efforts to avoid going into court. 2016 saw a standalone dedicated bankruptcy law. And since then, we've seen a lot of usage of that, especially compared to the previous decade before that. And so you're starting to build up precedent, you're testing the way the courts will treat things. And that has eventually led to the 2023 law, which came into effect this year, which sought to enhance the bankruptcy regime. There's probably a lot of technical changes in the law, which probably lawyers get excited about, but not so much from a business perspective. There are different things that changed in terms of time periods, the bankruptcy unit, bankruptcy registers, and the like. But I think from a business perspective, the biggest change is the reinforcing the focus of the law, which is on reorganization and restructuring. And you can even tell that by the name of the law itself. And so under the 2016 law, we had the concepts of preventative composition and restructuring. So they were your two avenues to try and rescue a business. Preventative composition was awkward. Its conditions were very, very difficult to satisfy, and as a result was never used. And restructuring, on the other hand, the restructuring route was used in certain circumstances and one or two high-profile cases. What the new law sought to do was fix that. And so the law is in many ways very similar to the 2016 law, but restructuring was retained as a route to rescue a business, but preventative composition was changed to preventative settlement. And preventative settlement has become much more user-friendly, so a sort of debtor in possession type regime, light touch. So you can go into court supervision, court oversight, and court protection through a moratorium, but it's a very light touch in that a trustee won't be appointed, so the debtor keeps, by and large, control of their business. So with that refocus of the law, now you've arguably got two viable routes to restructure, so preventative settlement and restructuring. So that should encourage more businesses to look at that court-driven restructuring.
Thank you. Is it fully implemented, and are you seeing increase in the usage?
Fully effective, yes. Fully implemented, no. So the implementing regulations and certain other things that were talked about in the law, like the register and so on, are not yet implemented. But the law itself is being applied. I don't think we've seen a spike in usage. We've seen a continuation of cases under the 2016 law that were there that are continuing. So there are cases before the courts, and there's probably a few more than people think. Obviously, some of those are just bankruptcy liquidation, so probably not that interesting to the discussion, but there are certain restructurings that have either happened or occurring. I think the new law has increased the discussion around the possibility of using it, but I don't think we've seen a spike in actual filings.
Thank you, Jody. One more question before we move forward. Now, when you hear about the restructuring or reorg, there are discussions about debt financing, exit financing, rescue financing. Is this a new opportunity? Is this something new here? Can you elaborate just briefly on that?
Yeah, I think anyone involved in restructuring, there's often the tension between a debtor's need for money, liquidity, working capital, and the creditor's apprehension on having any more exposure. So often the credit lines, working capital is turned off, bank accounts are blocked. And so actually operating a business to generate income to pay the creditors becomes a real issue. And we've seen that time and time again. Under the 2016 law and retained in the new law, there is the concept of new money. So you can apply with the court approval to get new money into the business that benefits from certain protections. I think the key that from our perspective we've always seen is the timing. How quickly can you get the new money into the business? And you've probably seen practical examples of how different systems work. NMC, which went through ADGM, arguably got approval for that new money a lot quicker. KBBO, that went through the onshore system, still got approval for new money, but arguably it took a lot longer. So there is that timing dynamic, but it is available, but with court approval.
Thank you, Jody. Omar, private credit is fast growing here in the region. And now with the downside protection, it makes that asset class even more attractive. The same law was implemented in India in 2016, and the private credit market now is at least 25 billion US. In 2018, they changed the same law, and it's fast growing there as well. Can you share some insight on the credit market and the development here in UAE and how you see this as an impact?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. So private credit is going through the golden years for it globally, and actually more so in the Middle East because of the fact that banks in our region simply don't play in the area that we provide financing for. More specifically, what I mean by that, when you look at corporate banks across the world, particularly in the developed markets, pick any bank effectively, 28% of our loan book goes to the SME segment, which is what we target. In the Middle East, less than 2% of any bank's balance sheet goes to SME lending, less than 2%, which is global worst, which creates an opportunity for folks like us, which lends itself to the question, well, how do companies even grow here in the first place? Well, it's usually their friends and family, they come from a big family, or they sell equity, which is quite expensive if you're a growing business. So the emergence of private credit, particularly over the last 5 years or so, it's been around longer, but now it's being done with the help of sovereign wealth funds from the region that historically never backed people like us, which they have now, to help us get the muscle to actually give these loans. So this segment is now growing at a rapid pace, and the big question mark for allocators who give people like us money to invest, well, what's the downside protection? How comfortable are you investing in Saudi? How comfortable are you investing in UAE? How comfortable are you investing in the rest of the MENA region that we look at? Well, now we're more comfortable than ever. Even though we haven't had any defaults in the previous 15 years of investing in the region, now you actually have laws that are actually meeting global standards. So now you're actually seeing not just regional sovereign wealth funds giving money to like ourselves, you're actually seeing international managers doing deals here. You may have seen Goldman Sachs, you may have seen JP Morgan investing in Tamara and Tabi, respectively, sizable commitments, different type of businesses, but you're seeing now large asset managers coming in and not just opening up fundraising offices, but they're actually seeing this as an investment opportunity. What does that mean for the rest of all of us? Whether you're an advisor to a family office or a business or entrepreneur or you're a family office yourself, you now can grow not just organically, you can actually grow with the help of structured finance that allows you to grow as our peers in the West have grown for decades. One the word bankruptcy, it's a scary word. The word debt historically has been a scary word in the Middle East. People don't like to use debt because it leads to bankruptcy. And for them, that's you might as well just leave the country and forget talking to your mother and father again. So, but in the West, one thing I recall when I started my career 25 years ago in the US at least, there was a testing center when I got my Series 7 for trading stocks. A US president was bankrupt 9 times before becoming a US president, and that was Abraham Lincoln. And that was back then. So imagine the advantage that the US has had for so long, having the proper structures where a business can have a hiccup, a business can have a challenge. Don't shut down, don't run to the airport and leave your car in the parking lot. There's ways to work around it, and that's what we're seeing now. That's the exciting part. And the government is helping with making the right laws. So private credit is not growing on its own, it's growing because of all the changes that are happening, Vision 2030, Vision 2040, and so on. And you're getting influx of businesses coming from across the world coming here now after COVID. So it's kind of a perfect storm for growth. So I think one of the things which I would assume is part of the reason we're not seeing filings of the sort is because we're going through a cycle that's growth right now. So it's great that these laws have come in now during a growth cycle, but I think there'll be a huge uptick because that's when you need it, is when things kind of go south. Right now, things are going well. Not to say every business is going well, but it's overall UAE and Saudi are on an uptick growth-wise.
Thank you, Omar. And that was, you covered 2 of my questions because you addressed that this is such a significant opportunity for the SMEs that are getting such a small portion of lending from the banks, so less than 2%. So this will be a step in developing more active market for credit, private credit, and it's attractive and more attractive for distressed and stressed investors as well. And not to mention foreign large asset managers.
Laura, to add actually to address part of your question, which I didn't mention, is the fact that in our region, when we look at private credit, when we look at even sectors like distressed and stressed, they're not the same as stressed and distressed in the West. Stressed and distressed for us, what we see are companies with a badly structured loan balance sheet. They've had 3 million dirhams from their cousin, 5 million from their uncle. They had a problem with their uncle. Now the uncle and the cousin want their money back. But the business itself is actually doing well. In the West, stress and distress is the business itself is actually suffering despite having financing options through banks. So it's a very different equation. And that's one of the things we demystify when international managers come here and say, well, how are you generating double the returns from Western managers? How are you doing? You must be going to really risky assets. Actually, no. The businesses we're investing behind or giving financing have lower leverage than they do with their peers. Not because they wouldn't use the leverage if it was given the chance. Banks weren't playing here. So the only other option for them growth-wise has been to sell part of their equity. And then you end up with having big families becoming bigger, but entrepreneurs remaining quite small. And that's something changing in UAE and Saudi.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. One more question. I believe primarily you make investments in Saudi Arabia and UAE. Do you think this will from a geographic perspective change because the risk profile has changed now in UAE?
It's a great question. Thank you. Actually, we look across MENA. We are a dollar-based fund, so typically we prefer countries that are pegged to the dollar. Some countries where we see opportunities like Egypt, for example, it's very hard to hedge the currency, so you'd have to find businesses that are export into hard currency. So while we look at all MENA, right now where the story is for the last several years and for the foreseeable future, it's UAE and Saudi that we can cherry pick better investments, better credit. So of the 2 billion worth of deals that we see per annum, the lion's share we can select from is UAE and Saudi just because of the growth story that's happening here. The other countries, for example, Oman, Bahrain, great, but from a risk-adjusted return perspective, why take that risk when you see Saudi from a government spend, from an FDI attraction, from institutionalization of businesses? UAE is attracting even more foreign businesses in. So it's a story that's of much clearer growth with less worry in our mind to sleep at night. But other countries, we still look at them. So I would say probably in this fund, we'll probably do at least 1 or 2 that's not UAE and Saudi.
Thank you, and it'll be interesting to see the development in the remaining GCC countries, how it develops there as well, in terms of the law. Andrew, given the recent adoption of the law in 2024 in UAE and in Saudi Arabia in 2018, this is a strong basis for increased trading activity in NPLs. If you look at the NPL bank balances in the GCC area, the balance is more than 50 billion. How is the bank looking at this? This is an opportunity for the bank to offload the NPL, right? Especially here in UAE, the NPL ratio is 5%, which is very high. Can you elaborate on this? Is the bank looking at this as an opportunity? Because also if you look at from investor perspective, who's buying it, there's more downside protection, and therefore this could really make it more developed market.
Good morning, everybody. Tricky question on NPLs. At Barclays, we don't have a retail bank, and we don't cover the SME sector, so it's not necessarily relevant to us. But I think if you look at the UAE banking sector as a whole, we'd have all seen the headlines quarter on quarter that it's been record profits for the banks here. So currently, I think there was some data produced last week by the UAE Central Bank, which said that from a capital perspective, the collective UAE banking sector was sitting on about 19-20% capital versus a capital adequacy requirement of 13%. So the banks have got really strong balance sheets at the moment. They've got a lot of capital in addition to what's regulatory required. Alongside that, you also look at it from a liquidity perspective, the banks are awash with cash. They've got over $200 billion worth of liquid assets currently on their balance sheet. So you've got a strong capital position, you've got a really strong liquidity position. If I were a CEO of a local bank or a large onshore bank that had a big retail, credit card, mortgage, whatever else exposure, SME exposure, if there's ever going to be a time you're going to sit in front of your board and say, let's take the hit on the non-performing loan portfolios, now's going to be the time to do it. So I think it's more a reflection of the conditions that the banks are in from a financial balance sheet perspective than it is necessarily the bankruptcy law. That said, I do think the bankruptcy law, picking up on the comments made by Jody and Omar, is the stigma of going bankrupt now in the UAE is very different from what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So I think collectively, the banks are in a position where they say, look, financially we're in a position to do this. Stigma-wise, there's no longer the stigma associated with going down the bankruptcy route. And I think from an individual perspective, it almost gives them for literally the get out of the jail, as used to be the case, card to play.
Thank you, exactly. And it must be an incentive for the banks to offload it off the balance sheet. You can sell it at a discount. That's what the investors are looking for, and the investors, especially distressed and stressed investors, see this as an opportunity. And it's interesting to note this year there started to be some portfolio NPL transactions earlier in the year. ADCB sold 1.1 billion to a hedge fund, which was comprised of 44 SMEs, and then there have been some other transactions. And if you could, so I really think this is an opportunity. If you could elaborate a little bit of this, and maybe Jody, I think you were involved in some of those transactions. Maybe you can share some insight.
I think I'll let Jody give the detailed insight because he'll know better than me. I think one thing I would say is that the banks are very careful from a reputational risk perspective. So in the NPL space, when you are looking to sell a portfolio, you need to sell it to the right buyer because you don't want that buyer to put your brand in a position at a later point in time where they have gone basically too heavy on an enforceability perspective in seeking to try and get back funding. So I think reputational risk is something, I can't speak for the ADCB deal, but banks will be very selective as to who they sell to. But to your point, you've now got more professional outfits and more mature outfits, as you say, some of the more sophisticated hedge funds who see this as a market now in which they are confident and comfortable to operate. And that plays to the whole maturity of the market here, where I think there's a growing confidence in the local regulatory and local legal regimes and structures to allow for those types of transactions now to flow through.
Thank you.
Yeah, look, in terms of the NPLs that have occurred, I think they're in a slightly different space. They're pure recovery. So at the stage of where the assets that were sold, the clients that went across, they're a pure recovery play. So it probably depends on the composition of the portfolio. And also, I think there's probably more activity in simple distressed debt. So single asset, single project, single client distressed debt, there's actually quite a bit of activity there, whether it's private credit coming in, private equity coming in. And so I think it potentially offers an interesting route for them in terms of when they're looking at the recovery. What does that look like? Can they use the law? Is the business still viable? And therefore they can come in and take the upside if they can restructure it and come out the other side. So, but to Andrew's point, on the NPLs that have occurred, the central bank itself is very hands-on in terms of the process. Although they have allowed on the 2 transactions foreign funds to essentially buy, that's largely because they're recovery. They're not performing loans, so they see it as a recovery transaction, but the central bank's very hands-on in terms of data, where that's what's the makeup of the portfolios, who they are, how they're going to be collected, what the recovery is. So the central bank's very, very concerned about those same risks. But bringing it back to the bankruptcy law, it really depends on the composition of the debt and what stage it's at. And that will dictate whether the restructuring or settlement is a route that they can use to help recovery.
Thank you. Louis, so I wanted to ask you your thoughts on the awareness of this law with the private investment office and the family office community. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Actually, families in Middle East in particular and within GCC, I worked with them in the last 30 years, and I was part of a lot of restructuring plans even before the bankruptcy law. Actually, I was counting. I was in 7 family steering committees, but I've been appointed by either by central banks in different regions or banks. And awareness, of course, they are not isolated from the system, but we have to differentiate 2 or 3 types of families, actually. The biggest or the tycoon families, where they are really impact on the system or on the economy is huge. And honestly, I can share this after 20 years. They don't have say, because most of the government, including European, they get interfere, and they're trying to basically either control or steering and appointing people to manage that families. I was telling Omar before that, one of the families which I was part of the steering committee, we discovered that almost 6.5% of that country's GDP is going through this family business. And frankly, we did the stress testing, and what if these families went down, basic collapse or bankrupt or whatever you will, we can say at least 2 banks will fall down. One of the basically restructuring, I will answer that, but just to add, one of the restructuring plan I was involved, I was telling Judy, 79 banks were involved. And honestly, to bring those banks on the table and to come up with a restructure plan, it's crazy. And another basically restructuring plan took us 59 banks. We share the names. But again, coming back, they have awareness. The second type of families, which they have their power, they understand the business, they have their lawyers, etc. But the situation is not supporting the business model, and they are trying to use the system as much as they can. And actually, we through my career, we did a lot of securitizations, But unfortunately, up to a certain time, central banks get involved, and they were worried that if we go through securitization and we use the recourse without recourse, then this will impact on the basically image of the system, or basically announce a lot of legal cases, etc. Third type of families is small, and I don't have anything to say, but like SME, and they don't have anything to say, and they've been guided by banks. One thing new and within family business in the region in particular, they are so sophisticated right now. And honestly, when long days back, when I used to go and discuss any transaction, I used to be commercial bank, then investment bank. Always I have upper head, honestly, always, I'm telling you. But now I have to do my homework. Means that I have to understand who I'm meeting, what's the subject, what's the pros and cons, advantage, disadvantage, and even though sometimes they have the solution, they will put something on the table, this is what we need.
The SMEs, now it's clearly an opportunity in private credit for the SMEs. There's a big liquidity gap there. But if I look at that to you, Andrew, do you think 2% from the banks lending to SMEs is very, very low? But do you think this changes the risk profile from a bank perspective, that you think that may change the lending to SMEs? Or do you want to share any thoughts on that?
Look, I mean, I'm surprised the number's 2%, but I'm not surprised as well that it's 2%. I mean, as well as working for Barclays, I chair the British Chamber of Commerce for Dubai. So we've got over 1,000 member firms, and a number of those member firms are in that SME entrepreneur segment, where they voice to me frustration about actually even opening bank accounts, et cetera, But I think the challenge the banks have is what I call quite simply cost to serve. As a bank, if you have a customer, there's a cost to serve that customer, and you're going to look at the revenue you generate from that customer versus the risk and cost that customer presents to you. And I think in the SME space, I think for the banks, the cost to serve is high. So yes, they are an attractive segment in some ways, but they also bring with them quite a significant amount of risk. And I think what we have to be mindful of is, we will all know in this room that the UAE a couple of years ago was put on what's called the grey list from a FATF, Financial Crime Action Task Force perspective. And the UAE, top to bottom, worked incredibly hard to get off of that grey list. And successfully, earlier this year, did get off of the grey list. And it wants to keep off of that grey list from a financial crime tag perspective. And I think particularly the regulators, so the central bank being the regulator of the onshore banking system, has put in space a very robust supervisory regime, which puts the banks under intense scrutiny. And then back to my cost to serve point, the banks sit there and say, well, actually, if I look at the regime I'm operating in, if I look at the revenue I'm going to generate from this client, actually, commercially, it just doesn't stack up. And I think that's the challenge, because you've got that going on, but then alongside that, you've got projects like D33, Dubai 33, where the leadership here have clearly stated they want to double the size of the economy over the next 10 years. You need the entrepreneurial SME segment to be a key component of that build out. And so I think at the moment you've got these competing forces almost. The bankruptcy law, for me, bringing it back to the subject today, helps in terms of providing another brick in the blocks that are looking to put in place a really strong and robust platform. But there's a lot of challenges out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just noticed something which brought my mind back. The 2% SME classification, if I'm not mistaken, I've been through this in other countries. There's misclassification because I know from my experience, a lot of loans which we given as a personal loans or consumer loans, it's actually went to the business, and this is considered by SME. This is what I was saying. Some banks in Oman when they try to use that, but actually, if you saw And without giving example, a lot of people working employees, and they have their own business evening, and they took loans, personal loans or consumer loans, and will be used for the business. But coming back to SME and for the bankruptcy, if we are, I assume, 70% of the Germany economy is almost SMEs, driven by SME. If we use the bankruptcy law, this is where my point actually, proper and managed through, presented in proper way to SME business, this will help SME business actually a lot. And this will give boost to SME, because most of the business or entrepreneurs, when you ask them why, you said, I defaulted, I was worried, I will be go to jail, etc. I can't write a check or something. This should be basically presented as exit route to SME sector, especially in this part of the world.
And just to add, I think to Omar's point earlier, you have to look at the whole system. So what's been happening over the last few years? Decriminalization of checks probably has a better effect on confidence than the bankruptcy law, to be honest. Because if you're talking about young entrepreneurs, SMEs and so on, they did run away, right? And why was that? Travel bans. Banks were probably guilty of using checks as a collection tool, right? That was their principal collection tool. So, you know, there's a lot of things that have been done, even through transparency, public registers, public searches, the way security is registered for banks and recovery methods and so on. But you have to look at the whole system and what the government's been trying to do to build that confidence, because decriminalisation should be seen in the same light as the bankruptcy law in giving people the confidence. There are still penalties, but usually that is for, you know, fraudulent acts or deliberate acts in terms of running that business. So I think if you look at the whole package, that's where the confidence comes from and will increase as they continue down that path.
Exactly, thank you. And I think given, you know, the market is evolving and they are developing, I think this is also brings, you know, gives confidence to foreign investors and really will can help the FDI for those ambitious goals all the governments in the GCC area have. Maybe Omar, you want to elaborate on this a little bit?
Sure, thank you. Actually, one example is quite recent and actually just became fully implemented as of yesterday. My old firm and one of my friends are still work there at NBK Capital, National Bank of Kuwait Capital, the only other effectively private credit fund in the Middle East, were acquired by Janus Henderson, $1 trillion, I think, AUM out of the US asset manager. And they did that not to get stripes to raise capital from the Middle East, but they're actually doing it to invest in the Middle East. So, well, why would $1 trillion AUM asset manager come into the Middle East? Well, because now they're seeing credit as one of the bastions of last kind of without using leverage, getting double returns of our peers in the West, our peers in the US and Europe. So you're seeing now, because of part of the rules changes, part of the visionary plans of UAE and Saudi, you're now seeing large asset managers come in and trying to come in a bigger way than they used to historically. Historically, they open an office in DIFC, a DGM, put a couple of folks in there to raise capital. Now they're actually moving teams here to invest. You're seeing that on hedge funds. You're seeing that on private equity. You're seeing that on large asset managers from UK, US. And I'm now having friends out of New York that I never thought they would even want to come here, right? They'd come here just for a fundraising exercise with their fundraising person. Now they're thinking, well, what can we do? Should I move to Dubai or Abu Dhabi? What do you think about Riyadh? Should I move there? I mean, when I asked them, are you coming here with your kids or are you coming solo? No, with my kids, my whole family. Because you also got to look at this not in a vacuum setting of what's happening here. You got to look at this from a global context. Where is it in any of the developed countries that we all used to boast about working, living in, whether it's UK, London, New York, that has a safety angle that has now become very prevalent? So along with the financial aspect of changes that are moving Western, the Middle East still has a strong security apparatus in place that you as a husband, wife, kids can go to school without any worries, without gun violence, without kidnappings, without you're getting mugged for your watch. So you're getting a perfect storm again. for lack of a better word, saying a storm, but it's actually a perfect catalyst across the board for business to flourish, whether large asset managers coming in through the form of acquiring teams or setting up offices themselves and bringing their teams here, or mid-market companies that are coming in from some of my neighbors in the area we live, used to be almost all Emiratis. Now we have people from Switzerland, from Denmark, Sweden, Holland, and they're all there. And when they first came, I thought, okay, this is just a blip. They're just here because it's not less draconian than it is back home. No, they actually moved their companies here. They've actually moved their companies here. They used to initially do 10% of their time here. Now it's 90% of their time here, and only in the summer they go back home. And I asked them this. Now we've become friends, and I say, "What?" I said, "Well, what's not to love? I can go out with my wife. I have no worries about homelessness. I have no worries about mugging, all that stuff." And so we are sitting in a time where I feel like it's a golden era for us being here. So capitalizing on it from an investment point of view, whether you're an investment firm yourself, an advisor to an investment firm, or an allocator of capital like us, we are seeing a perfect scenario where, don't know how long it'll last, hopefully much longer than people anticipate, but at least for the next 10 years, in our view, this is the golden period for us. And the markets are helping with rules changes, and the rules changes will continue happening because the healthy competition that's happening between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and UAE is causing both to kind of go toward best practices. And so each one wants to bring FDIs, which means we as the business community benefit. So I think it's a really interesting time for us all, for many reasons, not just the bankruptcy aspect. It's one of many reasons.
Thank you, Omar. I think you summarized it very nicely. The bankruptcy change is one piece of maturing the market here. It's developing and evolving. A lot of new opportunities for investors, for borrowers, for SMEs, distressed investors, and for banks.
A very interesting introduction. It was commented that the exposure of the banks to SMEs was 2%. I started the first Business Angels Network in 2009 here, and it was 2% then. But I think that the more important fact is that SMEs actually covers such a wide range. And I think if I remember correctly, the micro companies within that are up to 9 employees and up to 2 million dirhams turnover. And then at the top end, you've got the medium-sized companies, which are up to 250 employees and 250 million dirhams turnover. That to me is too wide a range. I think we've got to rethink the definition of SMEs because it's very convenient to put it into the pot of SMEs. And if I'm correct, I think there's 550,000 SMEs in the UAE. I think that it's time for the banks to actually look at the breakdown of their customers into sectors, because if it's in sectors, particularly some of the fast-growing sectors, then you will see the companies that are going to be the future disruptors to the companies at the top. And I think that if the banks are concentrated in that area, then they would get more customers. Because today, I mean, if somebody's sitting there and he's say regional director of Microsoft in the Middle East, and suddenly he's got the attention of senior bankers, but if he suddenly decides he's going to go and start his own business and possibly he's the kind of entrepreneur you want to invest in, then he becomes an SME and he doesn't get the banking service he deserves. I'd be interested in your comments on that. Thank you.
If I may, I could take that one because it plays into quite a relevant, our first investment when we launched in 2020 was a business exactly in that same, the gentleman is highlighting, a company that's called Stars Play Arabia, which is basically the Netflix of the Middle East. The founder of that business, Maz Sheikh, was ex-OSN executive. He was able to raise $150 million of equity from the likes of GE Pension, Etisalat, private equity firm out of Sweden. So really institutionalized cap structure, right? He was not able to get more than 2 million dirhams worth of loans from any of the 54 banks in the UAE. They couldn't understand what his business is. Now, in the middle of COVID, when everybody was sitting and glued to the TV, they still could not give him more than 2 million dirhams worth of loans. Why? Because there's there's a structural breakdown in the way the banks are actually structured here. The relationship manager is the one who wines and dines the customer, yet he's not the person who sits to the loan committee. It's a person who has literally a checklist to say, do you have land to give me? Do you have buildings to give me? How big is your business? You don't own anything? You're cash flow only? Good luck. That person has a career risk to take that even to the loan committee. So despite the 54 banks saying no to him, we were able to look into the business further to say, okay, well, what can we securitize? And it turns out that this business is not just B2C like Netflix is. It turned out to be, had a big component that was B2B, where they had long-term contracts with Etisalat and STC for upward of $60 million for 4 years, where they buy content and resell it. So we did that. Fast forward 2 years after our investment was made, ADQ and Etisalat bought them for over 420 million post-money. Same business. Now grown. All of a sudden, all the banks want to do business with them now, right? Because now they say, oh, well, now ADQ. It's the same business. It's the same business. And so this story happens time and time over again. So I agree with you 100%. The banks, unfortunately, don't have the right talent they don't incentivize the right talent to even look for those, I wouldn't dare say unicorns, but just right sectors.
We have three problems here, actually. Still, it's not been sorted out. Number one, definition of SME from one country to another. There is a global definition, but each country and central banks in this part of the world also treatment of SME within banks' books. And number three, the knowledge and expertise. I will give you an example. I was GM and CEO of banks before. And to bring up one of the SME business, you know what we did? Not my decision, was actually came from the board. I adopted. We brought ex-SME who was in the business. He's a banker, but he used to have his own business, and he understands what SME is facing. Actually, we developed that time special credit card for that SME, special loans, how to basically to collect that time the cash. There was no online business, how to help him to expand, etc. But they need to have support from central bank. They need to change the regulation, how to treat the SME banks. They have to have a proper definition, and of course, you need to bring the expertise on this line of business. Because that bankruptcy law now should help the SME, definitely. I will be really sad if this business not to grow up. And I believe SME should not be less than 30 to 35% of our GDP in this. I'm talking about UAE. If we have 550,000 SMEs registered in this country, I think this should have at least 30 to 35% of GDP.
So India has priority sector lending norms. Does UAE or Saudi have similar norms? And now supported with the new bankruptcy laws. Second part of the question is to Andrew. Are we going to see Barclays and people like Stanchart come back into the SME segment?
I can answer the second question. I can't speak for Standard Chartered, but no, Barclays won't. Not at all.
And I think, from not a banker, but I've worked with the banks for a long time, you almost see a division in the market between the international banks and the local banks. And partly that's by design from the central bank in terms of what it wants the international banks to focus on. Retail and SME, is that really where the international banks should be busy? Or is that better left for the local banks to support that market? And you're also seeing other government initiatives through Emirates Development Bank and other funds that are there to help the SME sector. And also, the alternate finance that's available today, even 5 years ago, wasn't there. When you start to talk about crowdfunding, NPLs, buy now, pay later schemes, private credit funds, which didn't exist a few years ago. So you're also building out the availability of different types of credit that's available in the market.
Thank you. And just adding to that, as I mentioned earlier, this law was implemented in India in 2016. And today, the private credit market in India is at least 25 billion, and surely has been supporting the SME development there. So hopefully this law, I mean, it's been supporting in Saudi since 2018, and same thing here in 2024, and hopefully this will be development also for the other GCC countries, and because there is such a huge liquidity gap for the SMEs, and this is really where this can be a downside protection, and it makes it more attractive for investors.